I think election truly doesn't make difference in Uganda.
I don't think Cameroon deserves any election.
So what then do Cameroon and Uganda deserve if elections are not the tool that citizens use to express their will and exercise their sovereignty?
And if elections no longer serve the people's purpose, then where does that leave their voices? Are Ugandans, Cameroonians and Tanzanians simply voting for tradition's sake?
Elections are not working in those countries because the autocrats who are in power are doing everything to deprive elections of their true meaning.
So what do these societies need? Places like Tanzania, Cameroon and Uganda, like George mentioned, where citizens are losing their faith in the ballot.
Perhaps the answer lies not in abandoning elections, but in reclaiming them. After all, when elections lose meaning, democracy itself begins to fade.
What is needed in countries like Cameroon, like Uganda, like Tanzania, is more democracy and not less.
But what does democracy really mean in the context of these countries? And does it still matter across the continent?
That is exactly our conversation today. Hello, my name is George Okachi and this is Under the Baobab.
And I am Mimi Mefoneu. Welcome to Under the Baobab, where we make Africa's complex issues personal and relatable for you.
Yes, and we do that every Friday. We sit down with policymakers, politicians, and African leaders to unpack the issues that matters the most. And so we ask you to subscribe to our community, and you can do that through our YouTube channel, DW Africa, and join the conversation.
Please don't forget to subscribe. So, at the end of last year, George,
Yes,
and the beginning of this year, a lot has been happening in Uganda, Cameroon, and Tanzania. Elections took place, and some of these issues that happened in these three countries I mentioned dominated headlines. And there were victories. And also people that were not victorious were not happy about the election's outcome. And because of that, there's been public mistrust generally. That's why we're having this conversation today, because we are trying to ask the question, why is this happening more and more, especially after elections in Africa?
Yes, and of course, looking at the controversy that, marred the processes in these particular countries that you've mentioned, it's pertinent for us to go back and to help us dig into this. We invited Dr. Christopher Famunyo, Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute, or NDI. Now, his job is to support and strengthen democratic institutions through citizen participation, openness, and accountability.
That sounds like a huge responsibility.
It is a huge responsibility.
That someone is there in Africa to ensure that there's accountability, good governance. You're expecting to see good governance at the end of the day. But for so many years, organizations like this have existed. And for so many years, Africans, opposition leaders keep complaining that the civic space is shrinking and people are not happy after the election that took place in these countries.
Yeah, Mimi, you will appreciate that during electioneering period, you would be happy to go visit Uganda or Tanzania or even visit Cameroon. But during election, it's so frightening.
And we've seen what has been happening. People have been shot. We saw in Tanzania after the election, we just did a documentary showing how people were killed on the night of the voting. An exclusive documentary that you can watch on our YouTube channel. We also did a lot of reporting on Cameroon, where thousands or more than 2,000 people were arrested in the aftermath of the election. In Uganda, even the opposition leader himself is saying that he's feeling unsafe. So the atmosphere generally is so tense.
It is indeed tense,
It begs to question, does election really matter anymore in Africa?
That is a very pertinent concern. And you see, when you ask such a question, election forms, it's a basis. It's like the vehicle that leads or rather steers, democracy. And if then it doesn't matter, then it begs the question, what then matters?
That is the question that we put to our guest to find out from him whether election still matters.
Elections are extremely important in every democracy. That's the only process by which citizens can choose their leaders, and through which leaders receive the legitimacy to be able to govern. So you can't do without elections. They are extremely important, and I think we need to work collectively to make them more credible and more meaningful.
Okay, yes, you can't do without election, and you've already talked about, questioning democracy because elections are not guaranteeing enough that there's democracy in those countries where they take place. So what do you say to this section of Africans who think that elections are not important but developments are?
I sympathize with some of that argument because I see the frustration of the African people in going through elections that have no meaning. And I can understand their pain and their frustration. Elections are not working in some countries because elections are bad. Elections are not working in those countries because the autocrats who are in power are doing everything to deprive elections of their true meaning.
These autocratic regimes are doing everything to stay in power, which is one of the reasons why democracy in countries like Cameroon and Uganda are really, really questionable. Is it not time to start looking at things from a different perspective?
First of all, when we say it's not working for Africa, are you saying that democracy is not working in countries like Botswana, like Ghana, like the Seychelles, like South Africa, like Namibia? No.
Let me come in here, Dr. Fomini, just to find out from you. You've mentioned countries like Botswana, Ghana, Namibia, and South Africa. But does a peaceful election mean democracy is being respected?
No, one peaceful election doesn't mean that democracy is being respected. Because we've also seen countries that had a good election at one point, raised expectations among citizens that the governments would govern justly. And we've seen governments that came into power, even through the ballot box, so underperform. So one election does not guarantee democratic governance, but one election, if it's done well, provides an opportunity for citizens to continue to hold their leaders accountable. Now, in the countries in which elections are not working, you're right, something is wrong. Something is wrong. And democracy in those countries is on life support. But when you have a patient that's on life support, what that patient needs is not less oxygen, but more oxygen. And so what is needed in countries like Cameroon, like Uganda, like Tanzania, is more democracy and not less. And let me also say that democracy, for me, is not a foreign concept to Africans. The word may be a big word, but when you break it down, you ask, do Africans like their freedom? Of course. Do Africans like rights and liberties? Of course. Do Africans want an independent judiciary? Yes. Do Africans want fairness in their elections? Yes. Do Africans want parliaments that take into consideration the needs of citizens and that can exercise proper oversight over the government? Yes. So when you go down the list of what constitutes genuine democracy, my sense is that you're going to receive affirmative answers from Africans. The problem is that when you put it together and you have one word, then you have propagandists who come out and say, oh, this is foreign to Africa, so it's not working.
Well, I like the way Dr. Firmino breaks down democracy. And when you look at it, it's a big word anyway.
Right.
And sometimes sounds foreign. But to you, Mimi, when you hear democracy, what clings? How do you understand it?
For me, it's freedom, it's liberty.
Yes.
To be able to express yourself freely, whether at the ballot, in the society, to speak freely and not being arrested. But this it sounds a bit like a foreign concept when it comes to the African context, whether you like it or not. It looks like you just said, it's a
borrowed concept.
Borrowed concept, but it's so wide that it's not really defined within the African context, because even though it's borrowed, we often talk about democracy in Africa when it comes to election, whether the leaders are respecting the will of the people, the sovereign will of the voters. But post-election, let's look at these countries in terms of development, in terms of how citizens are faring, in terms of how what the leaders are promising, are they delivering on those promises? That is also democracy, and we don't see that in Africa.
You know what, Mimi? Critics argue that autocrats, and autocrats in this case are, perceived to be the leaders who are clinging to power, use the exact sentiments saying that, democracy is a foreign, word to whoop emotions of, the citizenry. And this, in a way, helps them to cling to power. Like, say, in Cameroon, a leader would go like, yeah, Western democracy is not working in our country. We have our own way of defining democracy. But if you look the inside, it means that they're trying to rally support to continue their autocratic behavior.
I instead think, George, the other way around, because I think that the leaders are trying to use the Western model of democracy to stay in power, and they are not doing their own responsibility towards the people. For instance, let's say even that the president of Uganda has been democratically elected. Democratically elected.
Yeah, you're insisting democratically
yes.
elected. Yeah.
After the election, what
Yes.
happens? Are Ugandans having access to job opportunities? Are Ugandans having, the opportunity to speak freely? That is that aspect that I don't get to see or hear about. We only get to hear about democracy in Africa when it comes to during the election, then after. In terms of delivery.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're raising. Yeah, you're raising a very pertinent question, Mimi. And if the past reports are anything to go by, then you would clearly say that there is no tenets of democracy. It's not working, say, in countries like Uganda, because we've reported shrinking civic space. We've reported the opposition being denied opportunity to participate fairly in
and
elections.
even called to join the government in power. In Uganda, they are telling Bobby Wine to join the NRM party. But I asked Dr. Christopher Fomunyo whether it took the West centuries to shape their system. And if so, should nations like Cameroon, Uganda, and Tanzania keep borrowing or start building their own model of democracy? Let's hear what he told us about the realities in Africa.
First of all, it didn't take time for the European democracies to get to where they are today. I hear that a lot. But we have to keep in mind that in their time, as these countries evolve, they had no frame of reference. They had no democracies before them, except you want to go back to the Greek Empire and all of that. But they had no frame of reference. And here come African countries in the 60s that obtained independence and transition from being former colonies to independent nations. So the question is, we now have a frame of reference ahead of us. We're able to see what has worked and what has not worked.
But let's look at other countries, possibly like Singapore and UAE, where leaders are not supposed to be elected. But we see developments happening in these countries. Things are going well. I mean, when you want to look at development, if Africans or African countries could copy examples from some of these countries to see how or measure how well their leaders do, it could be some sort of a perfect example, so to speak.
We have been through the path of autocratic regimes in the past. We've been through regimes that thought they could transform their countries into the Singapores or Middle Eastern models, and it hasn't worked. Look at all the autocratic regimes, all the military regimes that ruled Africa from the mid-60s up until the 90s. We had a period where we've had over 100 military regimes on the African continent. It hasn't worked. Because even if one autocrat is bringing development, if you don't put in place a process that can allow for a peaceful transition when that one autocrat is no longer in power, there's no guarantee that the present day development will be sustained over the long haul. And we don't have to wait, and we don't have to tell Africans to wait another 200 years to get to the point where they would then be able to come back to democratic governance. I always say to people that there is not a school where you go and you graduate with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree and where you can ship all your citizens into that school and have them go through that course to become Democrats. The real school for democracy is through the practice of democratic governance, the practice and the amelioration of processes that we put in place. And so if we don't embrace it now, even in 10 or 20 years, we're still going to be stagnant in the position in which we were, and we have to work towards that.
Interesting conversation, but we want to take it out there to our people following us from these countries we are talking about, to hear from them what they think about democracy.
Yes, that is why we reach out to the citizens, of course, and they spoke to our correspondent in Uganda, Frank Iga, in Cameroon, Kilian Gala, and Naomi Jasera in Tanzania. They asked them what they think about elections and whether they still believe in them.
Actually, according to the scenarios and what happened in this previous election we have just heard, I think election truly doesn't make difference in Uganda. If a President Museveni still coming back 2031, we should do away with elections, period. Because previous election, what we saw is really, it was making sense somehow. Again, the other side, it was not making sense at all.
Our grandmothers and grandfathers didn't stop. They fought, they resisted until we got the independence. So I tell you one thing, don't stop voting, because one day that person you want or the party you want, one day, one time, it will come in power and you will enjoy what you want.
The first solutions is to make sure that the army is not involved in our elections. It should be the police only. The army should work on external affairs. And the other thing, there should be, the laws should work. They should not work on some and others they don't.
I don't think Cameroon deserves any election. Really, election in this country is being controlled by the government in power. And if we feel that we can change the system of election in this country and copy it like in other countries, I believe that we should have an independent electoral commission.
But that duration of voting and staying for about 2 weeks before the election comes out, a lot of things take place in the background. But if it can be like 2 days, 3 days, I think that would be good. So the solution is that the duration for the declaration of result should not be too long like that.
In a nation like Cameroon, where the president has the powers to appoint and dismiss, we cannot expect any free and transparent elections.
Elections does not necessarily reflect the will of the people. In legal and political systems that are expected to fail, such as this of Tanzania, alternatives to this include constant agitations for reforms, especially at least the minimum demands that would guarantee confidence in the electoral process.
Well, from those voices, it's very clear that trust in elections has eroded, and that is a red flag for leaders, institutions, and all the stakeholders involved, in the electioneering, sector. And organizations like NDI play a crucial role, and not just by promoting good governance. They send in, election observers to see if the elections actually comply with the tenets of, free and fairness.
Of course, NDI was not in Tanzania, Uganda, and Cameroon, but they've monitored key elections in many parts of Africa, like Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, usually people don't really trust, these organizations that monitor the election, because it's always like a written script, almost the same thing. The process is the same, and people don't really get to feel the impact, especially when they are needed the most and when things are really not going right after the election.
That's very true, Mimi. That is very true. And if you remember the case of Tanzania, what transpired after the election, of course, it was a contested election because of, what led up to that opposition being boycotting the entire process and, cases of people, dying during after the election. The AU was the first institution
just like in Cameroon
to congratulate the president-elect, and they did that on basis of their observer mission that they sent,
right?
Which came back with a report that the election met the standards of fairness and freeness,
except for some hitches that were observed here and there.
Yes,
but it didn't generally affect the conduct of the election.
The entire election. That is what they say.
We can even write the script ourselves. It's like, it's always the same thing. But George, in Cameroon, we also had the AU after the election. They were there before. and then saw the electoral fraud that took place in different localities, in different polling units, and came out and said that the election was free and fair. So sometimes we question, the role of election observers like the NTI, that Christopher Fomunyo, where Christopher Fomunyo belongs. And we ask questions, why are observers' missions report now facing a lot of contestation, and whether they are actually really relevant? Let's hear what he told us.
International observers today are more regimented in the way in which they do their work. And so sometimes when their statements don't match, citizens can be extremely critical. But what is gratifying for me as an African is the emergence of citizen observers across the continent. The fact that citizens, African citizens themselves, are not waiting for just international observers. They are mobilizing, recruiting, training, and deploying their own citizens to observe their own elections.
But the fact that citizens are now deploying themselves to observe the election, doesn't it show that there's been some sort of lapses at the level of organizations that are monitoring elections because they fail to some sort of, strike to be able to call it as it is when the elections go bad?
No, I think we should celebrate the complementarity. The fact that citizen observers can also work in partnership with international observer delegations. And I think that's one way in which we as Africans can take ownership of our electoral processes. But having said that, I must also decry the fact that in a number of countries, such as Uganda, such as Cameroon, citizens are being persecuted for even trying to observe their own elections.
Yes, as an election observer, has there ever been a situation where you observed an election, objectively saw that someone else won the election but was not declared winner, and you ensured from your reports that the election results were overturned and favored the right winner?
In 1992, during the presidential elections of 1992, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, for which I worked, observed the elections in Cameroon and said in writing that the elections were meant to fail. That was quite a strong call, but it's on record. I can also point to the case of Nigeria in 2007, where the chair of our board of directors at the time, now late Madeleine Albright, Ambassador Albright, Secretary of State Albright, was in Nigeria and said very openly in our statement that the elections in 2007 did not meet the expectations of the Nigerian people.
The examples are just very few.
Yeah, there are few, of course, but one thing also is that observer missions have no legal powers to overturn results, and no matter their findings, sometimes.
But the question now is, when they are giving the reports,
yes,
and even say that there were irregularities, who are they giving the reports to?
Yeah,
the incumbent that wants to stay in power?
It is for the improvement of the process. It's for the improvement of the process by all stakeholders. Maybe I perceive, but tradition or not, their credibility still, elections credibility still matters because it shapes how citizens perceive the entire process.
Right.
And still, Mimi, when it gets heated here, what do we normally do?
We retreat to the shade of wisdom, which is under the baobab. We get to talk a little bit. We make the conversation a little bit lighter and get to know our guest on a personal level. Who is Dr. Christopher Fomunyo?
Yes, this is the rapid fire segment.
So which African election worried you the most in the last 5 years?
Cameroon.
Okay. And one word to describe the state of democracy in Cameroon and Uganda today?
Oh, it's slipping in the very wrong direction. You can't look at those two examples and say those are democratic countries.
What is the biggest lie African leaders tell citizens about elections?
I think the biggest lie comes from leaders who steal elections by claiming that they've won and that the people have spoken and that they're in power because of the people's support. That's the biggest lie.
So which one is more dangerous to democracy, electoral fraud or citizen apathy?
Oh, electoral fraud, because electoral fraud is what triggers citizen apathy.
So if elections alone do not produce democracy, briefly, what does?
It's a combination of elections and some of the other factors that emerge from citizen engagement to say that democracy is a never-ending endeavor.
And then finally, what gives you hope despite everything you've witnessed? Just one word.
The African youth. The African youth gives me a lot of hope and confidence.
I forgot to ask him what his best Cameroonian dish is.
What do you think that would be?
That should be achu, maybe.
Achu, what is that?
It's complicated.
All right. Let's proceed.
So, yes, Dr. Christopher Fomunyo is talking about election observers.
Yes.
And during the conversation, he talked about young people or many people in countries like Uganda, Cameroon, because we saw it, and also Tanzania, are now taking up that duty to defend the votes and play the role of election observers, which also makes me to question, do we need election observers when we already have young people doing that job?
Yeah, the Englishman once say that once bitten, twice shy. And this emergence is only due to, the past experiences whereby you've presented yourself to carry ahead with your civic duty, which is voting, and then your vote doesn't count. Therefore, it's, the normal feeling that I need to protect my vote. And that is why we're seeing the emergence of, citizens observers, because they want to ensure that what they have done is a reflection of the outcome of the election. But I cannot also, I tend to agree with Dr. Fomunyo, where he says that this should be seen, as a complementarity. We should have, the citizens, the emergence of the citizens observers who do their task, and also invite international observers as well.
Yes, for me, it can only be complementary when the election observers start speaking the language of what really unfolded, the language of the people, because the voice of the people is always what matters, right?
That's
because
true.
They are the ones voting for the leaders. But if the people say the elections were rigged in so and so localities, and the election observers cannot corroborate what the voters, the citizens are saying, there's a lot of question mark, and there's need to build that trust between the citizens and the election observers.
That's true.
So I wanted to know, what threshold should election observers meet to be able to remain credible in the eyes of the voters in countries like Cameroon, in Uganda, in Tanzania? Let us hear what our guest told us.
I think that is really done by the way in which you perform your work, that people are observant and they see that if you are impartial, if you're open to ideas from both sides, if you talk to all sides that are involved in the electoral process, if you issue reports that are seen as fair and objective, then people believe in your work. For example, we just came out of a situation in Uganda, which also transpired in Tanzania, that was kind of conflictual in people's minds. You had the delegation that was sponsored by the African Union that actually did a lot of good work and issued a good report. And then people were surprised that a few days later, the African Union Commission out of Addis sent a message of congratulations. And I think it's that kind of bifurcation, that kind of almost dyslexic judgment calls on elections that makes citizens confused as to whether the African Union is praising those leaders for having organized good elections, or whether people should rely on the mission statements that were issued by the delegations that were actually in country and that did the work of election observation.
Today, we've actually explored how elections in Uganda, Tanzania, and Cameroon tells us about democracy within these countries, and also generally in Africa. We've also looked at organizations that actually observe election. Do they matter, and are they still credible? If yes, how and if no, what can they do to remain credible in the eyes of the people?
Yeah, that's very true. And from trust to transparent participation to power, our takeaway is simple, Mimi. Democracy can't thrive without citizens who believe their voices count. And for that, election, which is so central to democracy, must first regain their meaning.
And if you are interested in honest conversations like this, because we do this every week on Friday, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, DW Africa, where you can watch the latest episode of Under the Baobab. And where else can we watch Under the Baobab, George?
Spotify, Apple Podcast, and of course DW Africa YouTube channel, as we keep showing down, asking harder questions and putting power under the microscope. My name is George Okache.
My name is Mimi Mefo. Until next time, goodbye.